In this exciting episode, the marriages are even worse than normal. The medical profession is filled with adulterous men who believe in survival of the fittest, and small business owners are miserly nags married to dipsomaniacs. Quite a vision of mid-50s America. It's Season 1, Episode 22 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Fugitive Nurse. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies, too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode, I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia, as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler where, just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each week in the Law Library, we return to prior episodes to refresh our memories about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. In this episode's visit to the Law Library, we consider the episode titles. This episode, The Case of the Fugitive Nurse, and our last episode, The Case of the Green-Eyed Sister, we have title characters who are neither defendants nor murderers. It might be worthwhile to take stock of just who gets name-checked in the title. There's the defendant crew, of course. We have The Case of the Restless Redhead, Lonely Heiress, Negligent Nymph, Demure Defendant, and Cautious Coquette. Then there's the people who get got, the murder victims. We have The Case of the Runaway Corpse, The Case of the Haunted Husband. Then there are the titles about things that aren't people at all. It's surprisingly large. We have The Case of the Drowning Duck, Crimson Kiss, Crooked Candle, Baited Hook, Moth-Eaten Mink, Fan Dancer's Horse, and Sunbather's Diary. And then there are those episodes like The Fugitive Nurse, where the person is adjacent to the defendant or murder victim. In the former camp, we have The Case of the Sleepwalker's Niece, The Case of the Sulky Girl, and The Case of the Green-Eyed Sister. And then in the latter camp, where the person is adjacent to the murder victim or murderer, we have The Case of the Nervous Accomplice, The Case of the Silent Partner, The Case of the Angry Mourner, and The Case of the Vagabond Vixen. On second thought, it's more unusual when a title does feature a defendant or murder victim. Who knew? Duly noted. Without further ado, let's get to the plot of this episode. The Case of the Fugitive Nurse. Dr. Morris and Dave Kirby became friends during the war, World War II presumably, judging from their ages, when the doc saved Kirby's life.
If it wasn't for the doc, I wouldn't be alive today. Enough steel in me to build a jail.
The men have had considerably different post-war fortunes, however. Morris married a young wife and earned plenty of money with his medical practice. The older Kirby married a penny-pinching, battle-axe-wielding restaurateur.
Hey, young man, you dropped these screws.
Thank you, man, but I've got lots more.
I'm paying you on a time and material basis, and what I pay for, I would like to receive.
From what we can tell, Kirby doesn't do much with his wife's diner except for get in the way and sneak off for a nip of alcohol, a habit that may or may not be related to his battle-axe-wielding spouse's penchant for cutting costs wherever possible. It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Morris's marriage should not be an unhappy one. Unfortunately, both Dr. Morris and his wife appear to be selfish, and Dr. Morris eventually seeks refuge in the arms of the show's titular nurse. While Kirby doesn't cheat, he starts preferring Dr. Morris's company to that of his wife. Kirby's devotion to Morris gets him killed eventually when, posing as Morris, Kirby flies a small plane headed to Salt Lake City. Someone has slipped morphine sulfate into his drink and he dies in a plane crash after falling asleep at the wheel. At first, the authorities think it was Morris who died and they immediately suspect his wife. Perry, who is already representing Mrs. Morris in a potential divorce case, gets Paul Drake looking for both Dave Kirby and Morris's gone missing nurse, Gladys Strome. Drake's men discover a St. Christopher's medal. Christopher is the patron saint of travelers, with Kirby's name on it, indicating that Dr. Morris and Gladys Strome have fled the country.
What made Mason think of this bit anyway?
Well, he just figured that if Dr. Morris were dead, it seemed awful strange his nurse didn't come tearing home from her vacation. After all, she was supposed to be crazy about the guy.
The discovery fails to faze the authorities, however, who still think Mrs. Morris committed the crime.
Aren't you a little embarrassed, Lieutenant?
Embarrassed? Why?
You fellas were so sure Dr. Morris was killed in that plane.
Well, that doesn't make any real difference. Murder is still murder. Just because Mason's client picked the wrong man by mistake doesn't alter that one bit.
Everything points to Strome and Morris as the tag team killers, but when Perry grills Strome on the stand and even pulls the patented "I'd like to recall this witness at a future time" routine with her, we find out that Perry knows the real murderer is the case's other bitter wife, Mrs. Kirby.
He was no good to me alive. I figured he might be worth something dead.
In her own way, Mrs. Kirby is just as jaded as Dr. Morris. She sees the world in terms of dollars and cents, and when her husband becomes more financially profitable dead than alive, she kills him. The irony, of course, is that her own miserliness makes her the obvious suspect. She gives her husband the expensive platinum medallion so that he can be correctly identified after he dies, and Perry knows she wouldn't have spent the money because of affection.
What would you say was her outstanding characteristic?
The way she pinches pennies. She is the tightest dame I've ever seen.
Exactly. And when I heard she'd given her husband a present, and an expensive one at that, why,
You felt that she must have an ulterior motive, and that she wanted to make certain Kirby's body was discovered so she could collect the insurance.
Right you are.
And what shall I more say, for time would fail me to tell of this episode's airplane employee with the photographic memory?
Mr. Reese, don't you think it's unusual for a person to be able to recall someone else's license number so readily?
Well, yes, sir. I have a photographic memory.
A photographic memory? Well, would you be so kind as to demonstrate this gift of yours for us?
Why, certainly.
Now, you've just been interrogated by the district attorney, and without looking at him, please answer these questions. What is the color of his suit?
Charcoal gray.
Color of his necktie?
Gold and black stripe. The second button on his left sleeve is loose.
Brother of Gladys Strome with the tender tummy?
Don't bolt your food, Arthur. He has a very delicate constitution.
Yes, one can tell.
Or the snappy repartee that peppers the episode's dialogue?
You want me to go find her?
You think you'd have better luck than you did with the fugitive nurse?
Touche.
Now let's compare the television plot with the 1954 novel. I'm still confused about the novel's plot, so I'll just repeat what I've said the past couple of episodes. There's a load of differences between the book and television adaptation before I attempt to give that some particulars. Number one, the fugitive nurse, Gladys Foss in the novel. She's pretty much the same, except she's stepping in with a man who's already been married 3 times in the book, and she's not running off to Mexico quite yet, but rather to Sacramento, and it appears that she thinks her paramour is dead in the plane crash too, so it comes as a shock to her when her doctor lover is still alive. The doctor in the book is named Malden Summerfield. He's a calculating man who resorts to disguises and such to evade his wife, the authorities, and his various medical and professional responsibilities. The defendant, Mrs. Summerfield, is not a penitent wife so much as a greedy woman who hopes that Perry is crooked enough to get her some of her disappeared husband's cash, hide it, maintain plausible deniability about it, and then give it to her when the divorce is final. She doesn't seem to have the same yearning for redemption that the television adaptation gives to Mrs. Morris. There's Kirby, the murder victim, who has abandoned his wife, but for the South Pacific, and he's worked out a deal where he still profits from his wife's string of Colorado diners. The diners are in Colorado, not in Loganville. Kirby's wife is just as bitter as her television counterpart, but she's not the murderer. Mrs. Kirby, not the murderer in the books. There's a character not in the television adaptation at all. He turns out to be the murderer, Ramon Costella, who is Dr. Malden's chauffeur and a mob-involved airplane mechanic. He's the murderer in a plot that's too confusing for me to really describe. Imagine if somehow the photographic memory guy who worked at the airport was somehow also Dr. Morris's chauffeur and the murderer. Then you get a sense for what happens in the novel. And Perry's run-in with the law is way different because in the novel, the police suspect Mason of not only stealing Dr. Malden's cash and jacking potential prosecution witnesses out from under the authorities' noses, but being involved in some way in the crime. He's much more under duress in the novel than he ever is in the episode. As reported in Jim Davidson's The Perry Mason book, Earl Stanley Gardner was not happy with the rewrite of this particular novel, claiming that the episode for television showed little ingenuity on Mason's part, particularly in the way he discovered the importance of the St. Christopher's medal and thus captured Mrs. Kirby on the stand. And it's true that the episode completely removes the mob angle and substitutes a photographic memory airplane guy for a personal chauffeur, but Gardner was seemingly more upset with how Mason was handled than all the other plot stuff that got removed. I mean, you can't have Mason look like quite the same kind of genius if you remove a labyrinthine mob conspiracy. So just a quick deliberation here on the books in general, as this is the third episode in a row where the changes from the original novels have been substantial. It's worth it now to just say that Earl Stanley Gardner was a whiz when it came to plots, and I would gladly take any television episode based on one of his novels over one that was written brand spanking new for TV. And those are legion in seasons 2 through 9. The fact that the books and TV adaptations are so rarely alike isn't really a bummer for me. It's cool, and I generally enjoy making my way through Gardner's difficult plots. I don't think until I sat down to do this pod, however, that I truly appreciated the kind of hard work that the Perry teleplay writers were doing to untangle Gardner's mess and make it something you could wrap up like a bow at the end of a 52-minute episode of television. The fact that they got Gardner to pretty much approve most of what they did is even more fantastic. They consistently do it. Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is something about a particular character in the story. And a Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul this week concerns how much police sergeants get paid. Early in the episode, we hear that Dave Kirby has on him quite a lot of cash, over $92,000.
For a police sergeant, comes close to about 10 years' pay.
This means that a sergeant then, in 1958, was pulling in the equivalent of $81,500 in 2019 buckaroos. So here's this episode's research prompt. What does a 2019 LA sergeant make? Is it more or less than $81,500? Our Della this week concerns Maxine Cooper, the titular fugitive nurse.
You know, you're nothing like I pictured you.
What did you expect?
Oh, somebody very blonde with clutching hands.
I'm sorry to disappoint you.
I'm sorry, too.
Her best-known role was her 1955 film debut as Detective Mike Hammer's secretary in the film adaptation of Kiss Me Deadly. She's a nurse in another Season 2 Mason episode, The Case of the Caretaker's Cat. Maxine Cooper stopped acting altogether in 1962 after she got married so that she could help raise her family. And post-1962, she only has 2 television acting credits. Unlike many a Perry plot, particularly this one, her marriage was apparently a very happy one. She was married 44 years to Cy Gomberg before he died in 2001. She died in 2009. Our Perry this episode concerns Perry's diet. In declining Mrs. Kirby's gustatory advances, Perry offers this explanation.
Would you care for something? Our hamburgers are quite good. They're only 35 cents, and that includes French fries.
No, thank you. I'm on a diet.
Now, Raymond Burr famously lost 140 pounds to get the role of Mason initially, going from 340 to just over 200 pounds by the time the series started filming. And especially in this early part of Perry Mason, Burr was keeping a tight rein on his eating habits. Within the world of the show, though, I like to imagine that it's not the food that Perry is objecting to, it's the fact that he doesn't want to line the pockets of a murderer. Caveat edax, biter beware. Our theme for this episode is naturalism. Spare us the bromides, Gladys Strom tells Perry when he finally tracks the fugitive doctor and nurse down in Mexico.
What kind of happiness can you build on someone else's misfortune?
Please spare us the bromides. Janet tried to kill Charles.
Strom's jaded response is revelatory. The self-centered and ultimately fatalistic Morris and Strom brand Perry's truisms as bromides to avoid the truth value of those statements. Perry traffics in the cliche and banal, sure, but he does so to elicit and even diagnose the moral bearings of his listeners. Early in the episode, we see Dr. Morris and Gladys alone at the office. Dr. Morris has slept there in his clothes, and his face reveals a day's stubble and an anxious foreboding of what the future holds.
Ever look closely at a set of pathogenic bacteria?
Yes, why?
Little minute organisms, whipping madly about but really going nowhere. Still, the course of nature says that nothing can be really aimless. So they must take a direction and destroy or be destroyed.
While Dr. Morris finds a moment of tenderness for Strom following this, the doctor's cynical philosophy should make his future patients cringe. Morris is good at what he does, but he is most assuredly not good. Perry never adopts an unwarranted optimism. He doesn't speak of grand natural forces that will work things out. He offers a plan of action as well as a declaration of his own responsibility. This episode's worst characters are naturalists. Dr. Morris spins that naturalism biologically, and Mrs. Kirby spins it monetarily. Both are deadly. Now it's time for a Perry proverb. Perry's bromides, so-called, culminate in a fairly banal speech to Mrs. Morris just as she's about to be arrested. Again, he gets ridiculed.
I know it looks as though the world has just exploded in your face. But with time, we'll get to the bottom of all this.
That bit about time was sheer poetry.
I'm glad you liked it.
But Perry's speech is poetic. I'll give him that. More importantly, this is the kind of thing that the police should be saying. Trag is typically a dedicated servant of the public. So why the cynicism? Is there no collective memory in the show? If Perry says he'll get to the bottom of this, he's showed he probably will. Come on, Trag. Now let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
You know, there is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Thanks so much to those of you who gave me feedback on the case of the green-eyed sister. My Aunt Myra did some digging on the research prompt regarding the statute of limitations on robbery. Bank robbery, pretty serious business. You can be tried up to 5 years later at a federal level for robbing a bank, and even after that, many states can find loopholes to allow them to prosecute you. As for the state of Texas in particular, it looks like there's a 7-year statute of limitations on bank robberies, so Ned Bain was clear on that account because It had been a decade since JJ's crime. In terms of the civil limitations, that's a bit dicier. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this week's pod that you'd like to comment on or something that you'd like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Next time we've got a surprise, unhappy marriage featuring a blackmailing husband who, for shame, is bilking money out of his wife, played by Angie Dickinson. It's the case of the one-eyed witness. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat.